Well,
Perfect.
hello, everyone.
Wow.
Welcome. Oh my God, that was one. It's been an emotional, crazy time. And so thank you for that beautiful meditation. So needed to
Yes.
drop in. I'm Shira. James is my co-host
Yes.
and partner
Hello.
in crime for this. Do you want to introduce what The Other America is, James?
Sure. Well, The Other America is we call it a show. It's a show, it's a community that we started after George Floyd. Shira and I really felt that there was a needed and necessary space to have the tough conversations and to bookend it with meditation and mindfulness and something that Peace Inside Live is known for. And we hold this space to have the tough conversations, to say the things and ask the questions you probably want to ask, and to make sure that Black, white, yellow, Puerto Rican, and Haitian have an opportunity to gather and discuss. And we're so fortunate that every episode we have incredible guests. We have leaders in the community, and Shira and I's Rolodex is no shortage of luminaries and badassery in the spaces that are really tough. And we have one today, Shira. Maybe if you want to introduce our guest today, I'm really excited to get into this with this brother right here from the Carolinas of Eden.
Yes. Okay. Dr. David Kempt is our guest today. I'm so excited. I actually did his White Ally Toolkit class and workshop, and his work is just incredible. It's so needed right now. He's also been seen on shows like The Daily Show, which is pretty impressive. Just saying, definitely worth Googling him because you'll find an array of entertainment and information and education as well.
Yeah, he went to Berkeley. I love that. I lived in Berkeley, so he comes from good soil. That's awesome.
Go Bears.
Yeah.
It's all Pac-12. I went to UCLA. It's all Pac-12.
I want to do a proper just like introduction with his bio just to give a bit of context so we could dive into the actual work and have people ask questions and open up this conversation. That's why we do it as a virtual town hall. So he is considered a national expert in the areas of inclusion, equity, cultural competence, and intergroup dialogue. He's worked with everyone from the US military, the White House. He works with large corporations, foundations, governments, universities. He's written books, many, which hopefully you can buy. And we're going to include all those links as a follow-up to this. In early 2016, David founded a project called the Ally Conversation Toolkit Act, which has engaged thousands of people in person and online. And for this initiative, which includes the White Ally Toolkit workbook, it's a comprehensive guide for allies to effectively engage in anti-racism dialogue. He's also created the Compassionate Warrior Boot Camp for White Allies and Equipping Anti-Racism Allies Unitarian Universalist Edition. This is only a few things among many. I decided not to read the entire bio just for the sake of time. But Dr. David Kempt, thank you so much for your time and for being with us today.
Sure, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, so I want to get right into this because obviously we're in the thick of it with the election, with everything happening in this country. How has your work changed, or has it, as this socio-political landscape has changed?
One of the things that I've begun doing is to do some focusing on the election. I started the White Ally Toolkit out of my perception that the last election result was significantly a result of the fact that a lot of white people didn't know how to have a decent conversation with their family members, friends, etc., about the question of whether Mr. Trump's views were too racially problematic to have him be elected. So that was on some level, the impetus to starting the White Ally Toolkit. So now that the election has come around again, I realized early in the year that I needed to make sure that when all is said and done, I did my part to affect the election. That I was trying to advance. I did my part to advance the cause of people having compassion-based conversations about the election and the issues within it. So as a result of that, I wrote another book at the beginning of the year. I'll just hold it up briefly. It's called Compassion Transforms Contempt. And basically it's instructions and guidance to specifically white progressives about how to use compassion in discussing issues around the election. A lot of times, as we can talk about, a lot of white folks don't know how to have good conversations with people who look at the world very differently. And so the same issues that drove me creating White Ally Toolkit around talking about race, I translated that into talking about other issues around politics. So given as the election got closer and closer, I realized that I needed to create some more resources to have people talk about the election. So I created something called the Voice Project. Voice stands for Voters Organized to Influence Critical Elections. And basically it's trying to teach compassion-based ways of interaction so that people can persuade people to vote or persuade people to vote differently. So again, basically the election has considered to start to eat up everything like for everybody. But I'm happy to have a chance to kind of like promote people using compassion-based methods to talk about race or to talk about other issues.
And that's something that's really needed right now. I think a lot of people have a hard time with that because I feel like people think you're either on the right side or the wrong side. And so I guess how do you drop in to have compassion when someone is just not seeing your side, but also it feels like they're doing the wrong thing?
Right. Well, a critical one thing that is important to think about is that will drive your decision about how much energy you want to spend is what is my relation with this person, right? So a lot of times people have people in their circle, in their family, their friends, their church, whatever, who they have relationships with, but who look at the world very differently. So one thing that's important to do is to let your desire to connect with them drive your decision to be compassionate. But I mean, here's the secret. Whether they're strangers or whether they're friends, whether they're loved ones, or whether they have extreme views like these militia folks or the Proud Boys or the QAnon, or whether they are just a little bit different, no matter what, like using compassion is a best practice in trying to get through to them. So so on some level, it doesn't matter in terms of what you do. Now, it's harder. Those factors matter in terms of who they are to you and what their views are in terms of how hard it is for you to make the compassionate decision. But ultimately, your strategies to try to influence them need to be based around like recognizing their humanity, recognizing that you could be that person, and except for some things that have happened to you, and that you want to cultivate in yourself a desire to connect with them and to hear them. That ultimately, it's all, you get to the same result, whether they're really far out or whether they're close in. And so so on some level, you got to go to a place of like, okay, if I'm going to really try to be effective and not just feel right, I need to find a place of compassion to deal with them.
I have a question. It's a little bit about language. And just for context, I'm a child of the 70s, 80s, Oakland, Berkeley, Free Huey breakfast program. And so my choice of words, for me in movements really matter. And I just wonder, because on this show, we've been, for my personal taste, I've been eliminating the word allies. I think I find it to be a little light. And I just want
to be light. You said light.
The word's light. The word's a little bit light. It doesn't sort of convey the type of commitment. So my question for you is, now in the thick of what we're going through, and I imagine the White Ally Toolkit and the use of the word ally has been something that you've been using for a while. Have you had any thoughts about even just the word ally and a reimagination? Because I feel like it not only is it light, it also doesn't give me as the listener the feeling that like I have somebody as a Black man. When someone says to me, "I'm your ally," honestly, that doesn't mean shit for me. That just means like you held up a sign for a weekend in a Black Lives Matter. I'm looking for in the middle of what we're about to go through in this white supremacist fight that we're about to go through. I'm looking for more than allies. I wonder if you've thought about that word and whether that has different meaning for you today.
Sure. Well, let me start out by saying why I use that word, right? So it turns out that there's a big divide about race within the white population. Basically, about 55% of white folks think that racism against white people is just as important of a social problem as racism against people of color. So the split is about 55-45. The goal of the White Ally Toolkit is to shift that number to 55-45 the other way by 2025. So I certainly get that within the ranks of people who think racism is real, there's a variety of levels of commitment, right? And for that matter, within the ranks of white people who don't think racism is real, there's a variety of the levels of problematicness of them. I thought that I used the word ally because I think that it is important, given that the white community is that split, it's important to have some word that captures the distinction between those two groups. So I call the 45% allies and the 55%, I call them racism skeptics. I don't call them deniers. I don't call them haters. I call them skeptics because I'm trying to use language that they would feel reasonably comfortable with if they were in the room, right? So now I think that they're essentially wrong, but I'm not going to label them. I'm not going to label them in a problematic way because I don't like that when somebody thinks I'm wrong, right? Now, so the reason I use the word ally is because to me, it seems like a reasonably useful way of making a big distinction. Now, I certainly get that from an emotional standpoint, it is useful to have people who are not just like a little bit inside that line if you put it on a continuum, right? I understand that there's a whole different relationship between people who are at higher levels of commitment to the anti-racism cause, and i.e. commitment to racial equity, than there are people close to that line. But I think that given that there are people on the whole other side of that line, I think it's valuable to have some type of nomenclature to make that distinction.
Yeah, no, totally makes a lot of sense. And I recognize that my use of the word comrades can be a little jarring for most folks, even on this show. And so I essentially am a comrade guy. But yes, your explanation of why the nomenclature makes total sense.
And we had someone ask Rick, what is a better word than ally? And Christiana said, good question, advocate. You know, so it seems like he's into comrades, and I know accomplices is also something that we talk about.
Yeah, people talk about activists, advocates. I mean, there's different nomenclature for that, and I'm not against that. I'm just saying that at some point we need some word, some distinction that talks. I mean, let's remember, 55% of white folks don't think racism is a problem, so we need to figure out some way of distinguishing those people from other folks, even if we decide that these other folks they often don't have the commitment we want them to have, or they're problematic. We need to make some both linguistic and intellectual distinction between them and the people who don't even believe racism is a problem.
That's good. Thank you for that fact. I had no idea that that's where we were in the numbers. Thank you. That's great. Yeah,
the white community is pretty split. And so part of the goal of the project is to equip the people in the 45% to have better conversations with people in the 55%, right? So, and it turns out that it's almost kind of funny. Like, there's been surveys that look at people's comfort in talking across the ideological divide. So in this one survey, it focused on the divide about talking about Trump. And it looked at, talking about whether you like him or not, and looked at people who like him and people who didn't like him, right? And do you find these conversations across that divide, do you find them frustrating and stressful and frustrating, or interesting and stimulating? And here's the breakdown. People who were conservative, who liked Trump, found those conversations stressful and frustrating 52%, at 52% level. So the majority, but a bare majority. Black progressives found those conversations frustrating at 56%. Latino progressives, or liberals, found those conversations frustrating 61%. White liberals found it frustrating at 74%. So here's what that means, right? The people who have the most access to other people and who potentially have the best position of persuasive work are the least inclined to do it, or the most inclined to be tripping out as they do it, and thus are most likely to be ineffective. And these people who have the most access. So part of what we have to figure out is what's going on with y'all. Why y'all getting so upset? How come you tripping out that much in having a conversation with your own cousin, right? You cannot. It's difficult to kind of take a deep breath and engage with a compassion-based strategy because compassion works better, right? So some of it, I think, is a function of white folks had to learn, like, as much. There's a distinction between what you feel and what you do, right? Like the whole notion of the talk that people give their teenage children is about cultivating the distinction between what you feel, your outrage at how you're treated, and what you actually do, right? So if you're a person of color, you have maybe 400 years of cultural training about how you got to make that distinction. Yeah. So part of what I'm trying to teach is that, you know, of the many things, that's one thing that's important to be able to do. So it goes back to the original question: how do you hang in there? On some level, you got to cultivate the fact that you can do that, and that it's not, you know. Yeah, I mean, you know when white folks know that there's things from what you feel and what you do in court. When people, it's a gentleman in court, they know it, right? I've seen situations where, you know, you go to court and it's filled with people of color. It's not all people of color. And I've been in situations where, like, people feel they get mistreated by the judge, and they walk outside and they scream it. But when the judge issued that verdict, you know, the traffic fine or whatever, they weren't screaming then because they know there's consequences, right? So, but on some level, that they know it then, but that whole impulse is not as cultivated. So when they're talking to their cousin who has these wild views, I can't believe you had these views. You know, there's all sorts of potentially excessive responses that don't help you achieve the objective, which is to try to change that person's opinion.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
really powerful. Felicia actually had a question. I want to get into your also some of your tools, even though I want to tease it so that people then go to the site to then take a class or a workshop, because it's really powerful what you've decided to teach, the theories in which you help people to get there. So first, Felicia, and if you want to go on audio, Felicia, or video, let us know. That's why we do this on Zoom, to ask your question, or I'll ask it. Are you there? Well, she asked.
Felicia.
Oh, Felicia?
No, I'm just doing a variant on bye, Felicia.
Bye, Felicia. Yeah.
Hi, Felicia.
Hi. I wouldn't ask it any differently than reading it.
Yeah, you could just drive it. It's your voice if you want to ask the question.
Okay. Well, I guess I could add one thing. So the question is, how do we talk to those people who don't think racism is an issue? Because I find myself trying to teach people who already think it's an issue, and usually they're already pretty convinced. So now I'm realizing that, no matter how much I post or teach about inequality, or like, for example, the wealth gap or something, they can find reasons within themselves that don't have anything to do with race, right? So how do we help those people?
Sure. So I should ask Shira if she knows the answer, because she took the course. So this is like a test for Shira now. Okay, so Shira, how would you answer the question? You give your answer, and I'll see how you do. I'll grade you and give it.
Reflect. Well, I would do the RACE, which is that.
What's the core though? That's very good. What's the core of how you persuade that person?
Well, connect with where they learned that.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
So Shira knows the RAC method, which we'll get to. Yes. Let me just say that. Let me just get to the core of it.
Yeah.
The core way to teach, the core thing that people don't do, is to tell stories about the racism within them. It's the expand step, Shira, right? The core thing, like, as much as I like to, in my methodology teaches the RACE method, a conversation management strategy. We'll talk about that before we close. The heart of it is, like, talk about racism within you, because part of what you're bumping into is that you're trying to persuade people with facts, and as a general matter, we know that facts don't necessarily persuade people. What you want to shift the conversation towards is one about experiences, and the core experience you want to make sure you get to. And again, we will discuss how you get to it. You don't necessarily lead with this, but what the core thing is to talk about racism within you. So if you're trying to persuade, essentially, I'll frame it like this: a whole bunch of people who, allies or other folks, let's say this are allies now, as they try to persuade people that racism is real, where they come off like this. You know, there's racism in society. And as a matter of fact, I think there's racism within you. Me, though, I'm fine, right? As opposed to, you know, sometimes there's racism within me. You ever have that? And it looks like there's racism in society. I'm not the only person. Is there racism within you? Like it's a whole different invitation. So I think so while talking about facts and wealth gaps and all that is fine, I think you create a kind of a shift if you ground your persuasive effort in, you know, sometimes there's racism within me, and then connect that to these larger forces.
And I think people we've talked about this within the classes, like I think people get scared of that, including white people, if they consider themselves an anti-racist, being like, I don't want to even step into that. But that's where our power lies to, one, realize like we all have inherent biases based on just us being white. And there's moments that we have made mistakes. And if you could connect on that common ground, it could help expand a conversation.
It's not just based on you being white. It's not just based on you being white. It's like, okay, this is part of anti-blackness in the society, right? So hashtag, we all have the virus, right? So it's not just you being white. Like it's a fact that we all are subject to anti-blackness thinking or anti-of color or white superiority thinking, because that's how society works. Like we're all trained on that. But you are right that people don't like to, like, they don't want to admit it. They don't want to admit to themselves versus other people, right? And that's part of what keeps racism in place. So Ibram Kendi, the guy that's, you know, how to be an anti-racist and stand from the beginning, he says the heart of racism is denial and the heart of anti-racism is confession. So what you want to cultivate is the ability to tell that story about how, you know, when the black guy came to talk to your group at the job, you were like, ooh, he's really smart. Like, and like a colleague, a friend of mine from college told me about, like, that's how his racism shows up. George Bush talked about it. That illustrates like that George Bush thing, the soft bigotry of low expectations, like that's, so one way that the white superiority thinking shows up is in that. Another way is like criminalizing people mentally. I have, you know, a story that I tell is about like the way that, I'm sorry, I can't shut off my landline. I keep a landline to make things clearer, but sometimes it rings, I can't cut it off. The core story I tell is of one time when I was in Minneapolis and I was walking around there. They have like these sky bridges that connect all the buildings. And I'm walking around and I pass this black guy, and then a little while later he's walking the same direction, and he looked like Somali. And so I went through this whole like mentalization thing where I turned him into like Somali terrorist stalking me. And he was, you know, he was just a dude walking around. Like he had an empty backpack. Why does he have an empty backpack? I went through a whole tripping out thing when he was just like, turned out he was just taking his backpack to this luggage repair place. But like I criminalized him, and I wouldn't criminalize some similar age, similar looking white dude. But I'm just saying I'm subject to white superiority thinking myself. So I'm just saying the point. So yes, maybe white people are more subject to it, but here's my point. Hashtag we all have the virus, right? So the issue is the way to most effectively engage somebody who's in racism denial is to talk about how racism is live within you. Now then the other stuff can come later, but that's going to be more effective than some statistical analysis or some recitation of concepts that you learned in school.
Well, it's interesting because I've been obviously talking a lot about white privilege, and sort of an analogy I use is that I, as a privileged male, right, you know, have a duty, you know, in the locker room when a guy is talking about Shira to you know, I recognize my privilege and recognize as an able-bodied male that I'm going to be in environments where I need to stand against, you know, talk against Shira, right? And that's actually what I expect of white people in general. When you're at dinner table with Scotty and Johnny this Thanksgiving, that you use your privilege and your power being at the table with your cousin and them, as you like to say, David, in the same way that I'm going to use my privilege as an able-bodied man in the locker room. And so that just tapping on what you're saying, just I recognize my own privilege and try to talk to white people from that same position of, it's a position of privilege. It's a position of, being in that situation is.
How do you? I think that's really wise. So when you're trying to make that point, how do you talk about what you just talked about was the obligation of the privilege?
Yes.
How do you talk about what the privilege is?
Yeah, that's a good point. How to talk about what the privilege is.
So here's my point about that. So I ultimately think that the core divide about racial issues really comes down to three questions, right? One of them is, can you be unconsciously biased, right? Can you be unconsciously biased is really the same question as, is there white privilege, right? Are there some people who benefit from a certain set of assumptions while other people do not? So that's one question. The second question is, does the racism of the past have any implications for the racial hierarchies now? And then the third question is, are there any moral implications if either of the first two questions are yes, right? So what you did was talk about the notion of the third question, the moral obligation, if you're in a privileged position. So I get that. And I would say that what I try to do is to illustrate the notion of privilege by talking about the small domains in which, as a Black man, I have been privileged, right? There's a small number of domains, but it's true. So going back to Berkeley, when I was a much younger man and much fitter, and we'd go to the basketball court, I go to the basketball court in neighborhoods where they didn't know me, and all sorts of presumptions were made about how good I was. Now I was good, but they didn't know that, right? So that I benefited from a kind of unearned racial advantage. I tend not to call it privilege because I think that calling it privilege trips people out, but that's a separate question. But I benefit from unearned racial advantage. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I just want to invite you to think about, if you're trying to talk to somebody about the obligations of privilege, the third question, what you want to make sure you do is to talk about the experience of having the privilege, right? Because part of what happens is that people don't see themselves as having an unearned racial advantage or earned advantage in any way. And the reason I call it unearned racial advantage and not white privilege is because anybody can have it. It's just a question of in what domains does it exist, right? Me as I had unearned racial advantage in a very small number of domains, but it exists in those domains, right? And it's useful to lift that up. So, and then you go to the question of what are the obligations of that?
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually had this conversation / it felt like an argument before I took your class, even though I'm still learning, with a bunch of guys about privilege. Specifically, there were some friends who were immigrants, and they said, it's not fair. I came here. I had nothing. I had to just work just as hard. So where's the privilege there? And I feel like that is an excuse / argument that people can make. And so how do you deal with that when that comes up?
Well, okay. So I think that it is unfortunate that we landed on the word privilege to explain this whole concept. I think that's unfortunate, right? That's why I used it. I'm still trying to brand unearned racial advantage, although it's such a mouthful term, right? So I'm not sure that branding effort is going to be successful. So I think, and the reason I think it's unfortunate is because we think of privileges, we associate it easily with economic privileges. And so it throws us off, right? I think the best explanation though for what unearned advantages or privilege is that it's about not having to deal with certain obstacles. And so the question, I think that so first of all, I try to get people away from the notion of the term privilege because I think it puts people into a whole different mental category where it's harder to make the conceptual leap. So I'd invite you to do that. Second, I would say that I think to talk about advantages or disadvantages or unearned advantages, disadvantages, and then to illustrate ways that you experience yourself unearned advantages, i.e. you don't face certain obstacles based on certain types of status, although obviously as a woman, you face certain disadvantages based on status, right? So I think that the issue is to try to make the point to somebody is to one, tell your own story and occupy it yourself. Be careful of try to avoid using too much language that we know tends to throw people's heads into a spin and make it harder. And then ask the question. So let me give you an illustration of how I do it in a workshop. Now it's hard to do this in a one-on-one conversation. Although some people have tried this. So in a workshop setting, what I often do is like we used to have live in-person workshops. I miss those days. But what I would do is I do something called the skin you're in game, which I tell people, aliens have come to Earth. Wow, we now know we're not alone in the universe. And it turns out that they have this superpower. And one of the superpowers is they can put you on the opposite side of the color line tomorrow morning and for the rest of your life. And they make you an offer to do that. What are the things you're going to think about as you decide to take their offer or not? And then people get to write down their ideas, and then they share that group, and they see a video about systemic racism and implicit bias. And then that's a nice conversation, and we talk about that. And then at the end, we say, okay, so it turns out that they need a bunch of people. They have very powers, but not unlimited money. And they want a bunch of people to do this, but you have to bid on how much you need to get paid to deal with the headaches of doing that, right? So to deal with the considerations, so whether it's safety considerations or whether people want to accept you or all that. And of course, the average amount of money that people want is like over $500,000, right? Now, are there people who say they don't have to get paid because, the joke answer is a negative amount if I can dance better, right? But most of people like want to get paid because they have thought about what it means to be on the opposite side of the color line. So part of what you might do in the conversation is to say, let's have to do the thought experiment. If we could snap your fingers and make you an immigrant or black or whatever is the category tomorrow, how much do you need to get paid in order to be compensated, be made whole for the headaches you're going to endure? But again, you want to do so if people are sort of tuned up to argue, this is going to be less effective. What you ultimately are trying to do is to be in a dialogic frame. And that goes back to the race method, which you probably need to discuss now. But I mean, because maybe
this is a good time to discuss that. Yeah.
But can I just ask one thing? Sorry, is your toolkit, how does it alter for Black folks versus talk? I mean, for Shira to have that conversation, it's one thing. For me to have that conversation, it's a totally other thing. So is your work primarily for white people who are talking to white people? Because I guess I'm missing a little bit of the nuance.
Sure. No, you're not missing it. I wrote it because the people, let's be clear, I wrote it because people ain't talking to their cousin. Right. That's the motivation. Now, it turns out that these compassion-based ways of relating that are about connecting to people, I'm going to lay out the method in a minute, like it's harder for people of color to do it on racism because ultimately, as I will discuss, the core thing to try to move somebody, to persuade somebody in general is that it's ABC, agree before challenging. Right? So the core thing you're trying, and that's just true no matter what the topic is, but it's harder for a person of color. Yeah. Somebody says something racially problematic, it is just harder to find something to agree with before you challenge it. Now, it's not impossible, it's just harder. So I'm not saying this can't be used with people of color, it's just like a harder thing on racism by the nature of what the method is. Okay, so on racial topics, the method I teach is called the race method. So it helps you easily remember it. On non-racial topics, I call it the reach method. So you're trying to reach somebody. But on racial topics, it's the race method. And race stands for reflect, ask, connect, expand. So I'll go through them briefly. So the reflect step means calm down, like take a breath, go within, do what you got to do to calm down. Go to the bathroom, take deep breaths, whatever you got to do to calm down, to center yourself, right? Because you're not all activated in a flight or fight stance, right? It's useful also to like rekindle your compassion while you're trying to calm down. That's a useful thing. Ask. What you want to do if somebody disagrees with you is agree before challenging. What you want to do is to try to understand where they're coming from. So ask questions to try to get them to talk about what they believe. And most importantly, the stories that relate to why they believe it, because you're better off having a conversation that's grounded in experiences than one grounded in facts or beliefs. So you want them to go beneath their belief to the experiences that drive their belief. So you got to ask questions, and you got to be able to listen to that empathetically. You're not trying to yeah but them when they're telling you their story. Okay, so reflect, ask, connect. Here's the part that's, I mean, it's hard in general, but it's even harder for people of color because of what I said earlier, which is you got to find something right in what they said, even if it's like the brother of what they said. So they say that, I don't understand why all these people complaining about police abuse. Everybody knows if you just act right with the police, you'll be treated fairly. Now, you don't believe that, but you do believe there are good cops out there. So the good cops out there is like the cousin or the brother of their racial problematic statement. So you tell a story about this. You ask them why. You ask them. You calm down, reflect. You ask questions. Well, that's an interesting way of looking at that. Why do you think that's true? And they tell you some story about why they think that's true. So you say, okay, that's interesting. That reminds me of this story. And then you tell them your good cop encounter story. It doesn't have to be a person of color, but it's just a story about a cop acting professionally. Maybe you witnessed the person of color, they were treating the person of color fairly. Maybe it was you, whatever. You tell a good cop story, and I certainly agree that there are good cops out there. So you have agreed with them, right? And you do all that before you tell them some story that is a story, not a bunch of facts out of a book, but a story that illustrates why you think racism is real. Now, maybe you tell a story about like a break that you got, if you're a white person, a break that you got from a cop that you have reason to believe a person of color might have not gotten that break, or maybe something you witnessed, or maybe it was your friends in law had an experience, or whatever that is, right? The closer it is to you, the better it is, because at least it's less subject to being torn down by their skepticism. But the point is, you make it a story, right? And so the goal for as somebody who's developing their allyship is to like first develop a couple of stories, and then over the course of time expand the stories they tell. So somebody says something, you have a story about that relates to the cop thing. You have a story that relates to there's no such thing as white privilege. You have a story that relates to people of color are lazy, or whatever it is. Over the course of time, you want to expand your toolkit of stories, but just start out with a couple. But anyway, that's the method. But so what's important to do, to do that, you got to cultivate methods of relaxing. You got to cultivate the capacity to listen. You got to cultivate at least one or more stories that are about, like, what's a story that if I told it, a racist skeptic would highly likely think I'm agreeing with them because I actually am, right? And then what's a story that the stories about the expand step is best if it's about your own bias. So, for example, in the example I just gave, if I told a story about the story I told about like criminalizing the Somali terrorist who was following me, right? So you might tell that story and say, well, so if I'm doing that, I'm not a racist person. I wonder whether or not cops might be doing that at a critical moment. They're doing this over criminalization. But so you ground it in like your own story of a moment of bias, and then sort of blow that out to say, well, if I'm doing that and I'm a good person, then maybe cops can do that. So maybe racism still is a factor. Yeah, was that clear? Is that reasonably clear?
That was really wonderful, Dr. David. We'll have to add, I'll let you know when I'm done, but I have a friend who's a black cop who actually has that same conversation with me. Black folks just acted right, so we'll have to add an addendum to one of your books where scenario, 1G, where I'm a black person talking to a good black cop having a conversation about black people, which adds a layer of complexities. I'll have to hit you offline on that one. But that was really, really clear. And I really, really appreciate the way you talk about this sort of toolkit and this, backpack full of stories. I think it's so helpful. I would imagine very helpful for people in the audience. Sharon, I imagine you got a lot out of this. I actually now see why Shira's language and the way she's talking lately has been really affected by taking your courses.
I'm trying. Yes, I'm trying. I'm inspired by. I must say, I'm always learning, and I think that's the important thing. Like this idea that you could be the perfect ally or comrade is ridiculous to me because there's always going to be moments. There's going to be moments, and you need to stay curious and you need to stay humble around that. That's what I feel.
That's right. That's right. So just on that, to further developing that point. So James, part of what I encourage people to do in terms of them, developing an arsenal of stories, one of the important things to do if you're trying to how do I connect with somebody? And so I'm going to lay this out to you because what I'm about to say can be particularly hard for a person of color, which is how do you connect with somebody, right? So one of the things that I think that people who are progressives in general don't like to do is to acknowledge progress. So one of the things I encourage people to do is to cultivate a racial progress story. And of course, there's reasons that we don't like to acknowledge progress because we rely in this sort of pitched battle between the forces of retrenchment and the forces of liberation. And because, we are so nervous that people are going to give them an inch or take a mile, we don't like to acknowledge there's been clear domains of racial progress. We don't want to admit that. Now, I don't know how old you are. I might be a little older than you, but I bet you are old enough to remember when it was actually the spontaneously forming white mob was actually running. I'm old enough to remember, I used to live in New York in the 80s. In the 80s, in New York City, in the confines of New York City, there were 3 different times in which a spontaneously forming white mob killed a black man, and people who didn't know each other that morning worked together to kill somebody before the day ended. So I'm not talking about white supremacists. I'm not talking about police. I'm talking about a mob that forms, and some black man winds up being dead because of the mob. That mob has been running for 400 years. It ain't running now, right? It's that doesn't happen now. That's a good thing, right? That affects my freedom of movement. Now, am I more afraid of the cops than I used to be? Yes, but I'm less afraid of spontaneous forming white mob. That mob ain't running no more. So I'm just saying that's one illustration of progress that has been made, but progress that we often don't like to acknowledge because we don't want to give them an inch or take a mile, right? So we got people who think there's all progress, and they don't want to. So we don't want to acknowledge it. Of course, there's been progress. And I'll close this by just quoting John Lewis. I used to, one of these congressional pilgrimages that John Lewis did to the South every year. And I was on one of them, and we would go to these various civil rights sites of history where he made it often. And one time he said, the only thing more irritating than white people who think it's been all progress, no more work to do, are black people who think there's been no progress and that we haven't done anything. He said that. So acknowledging progress is not only important from a spiritual, psychological standpoint, it's important from a linguistic and tactical standpoint if you're trying to move somebody forward. But often we don't want to do that.
Before we close, I just wanted to pivot a little bit, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know we blocked.
And if we have questions, just continue putting them in the chat.
Yeah,
we can
totally.
Get some questions going.
David, my work by day is working with corporations and working with venture capital firms and working with organizations that they too need to have the tough conversations. They too need to look at the way that their board is constructed, the way their executive teams are constructed, the way their cap table is constructed. In order to build the liberated 21st century company of the future. And I know that's a lot of your work. And I wonder, just for those of us that work in those arenas who have to fight the systemic racism fight that happens every day that affects all of us. I'm just curious, what are some of the tools in your toolkit to do that kind of work? And I know that's part of your work. So
I think the critical thing in that domain to open the door up is that first question of unconscious bias, can you be racist without intending, right? So that is a critical thing. So in my baseline training, I meld discussion about unconscious bias and the science behind it and how it's related to human cognition, and gradually lead people up so that the defenses are down, openness is up, to how like we see in all sorts of domains, in education, in medicine, in policing, in perceptions of children, we see like there's this like hashtag we all have the virus, right? So laying that foundation down is an important thing to do. And then you go from there to this whole microaggressions, another term that I think is unfortunate. I'd rather call them inadvertent dignity violations. Again, I'm having trouble branding that, but inadvertent dignity violations is better because microaggressions doesn't capture the inadvertent nature of them, nor does it capture like the fact that it's a violation of somebody's dignity, right? So, but the point is that if we set the foundation down that we all have this, we're all subject to anti-white superiority thinking, and then that comes out in our interactions, then that's sort of a first step. And then we can look at like, okay, and then you can troubleshoot that. How do you learn how to be a bystander and all that? But then after that, you can say, well, okay, if that's true, let's assume that's true. Then then you can deal with the second question: how do the structures of the past affect our current arrangements? And then are there any moral implications of that? But I'm just saying part of what is important to do is to take the kind of like, to make it less about blame, more about responsibility. And I think that part of the reason that the administration is banning diversity trainings is because I think it's wrong-headed, but ultimately they're responding to the fact that too many of these kind of trainings turn up the blame dial and as opposed to the responsibility dial. And so part of what you're seeing is people are sensitive about being blamed anyway, right? So I'm not saying there's not problems on the other side. I'm just saying that that's part of what that's a reaction to, and that I think that in an institutional setting, part of what we want to create the sense is how do we have a productive, non-blaming, responsibility-taking conversation about not only what we are doing, and the second, what we are creating through institutional structures.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think it can be challenging because you want to create a safe space for people to be seen and heard. And sometimes that does involve letting out blame, because there is blame, fingers, people want to point fingers, they want to express themselves, they want to share what's been on their mind. So how do you find that balance?
Well, I mean, I would say that the core is it's more like the core is to surface that harm is being caused, right? So you're right, people want to go to a blame thing, but I mean, here we get to the intent impact distinction. Like, if somebody says to me, I don't think of you as black, right? Now, they could do that from like, that could be really hurtful to me, right? I like being black. They're trying to invisibilize me, et cetera, right? So it's okay for me. It's useful for me to occupy the fact that is hurtful to say. It can also be possible the reason that like they have a totally positive intention in that. Like that's not where they're coming from. So part of the difficulty in just human relations is melding the fact that sometimes you can have a really negative impact action that has a positive intent. And so the question, and so when it's me acting, I'm very much in touch with my intent and less in touch with the impact. Same true for everybody and the opposite for everybody else. So what we're trying to do collectively is to try to establish a culture in our community, organization, whatever, where we can talk about the way the intent and impact can get out of whack. It doesn't mean that the intent is the only thing that matters, but just saying part of the trick from a leadership standpoint is establishing a culture where people can have dialogue about these dilemmas that cannot be easily resolved. And so part of what leaders need to do is to take affirmative action to move their culture so it's a dialogue-based culture where you can, in fact, talk these issues through, right? And deal with this just fact of human existence that sometimes intent and impact get out of whack. And we just have to sit with that and then say, how can we, live together in community and recognize that, what you didn't mean it, but it was really harmful. but yeah, you didn't mean it. And so, because as you said, part of it, if somebody says something's hurtful, I want to go to like that they intended it, right? And it's hard for me to sit with the fact they might not have meant it. Just like if somebody does something really hurtful that they didn't intend, it's hard for them to sit with the fact that it really was hurtful.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Hey, Shira, let's open it up for some questions if you don't mind.
As we wrap up, yeah.
Yeah, let's wrap up and take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, I know there are some different people saying different things. So thank you so much.
Who's bold?
Yeah, who wants to turn their mic up? Yeah, unmute themselves.
I see Rick Fossum. He has his hand raised.
Hey, Rick.
Hey, thank you for letting me listen. Curious about the role of lament, particularly for the white person in this journey, because I think a lot of us can get tactics that we want to go apply to do our part, but without that sort of core internal work of self-recognition, self-exploration, the heart work. Could you maybe speak a little bit on the importance of that before we even get to a race method?
That's so interesting. I want to answer the question. Say more about, I never heard it put that way, the role of lament. Say a little bit more about that, what you mean by that.
Well, it's interesting because I've been walking through, I'm in Atlanta and working with a lot of groups of white folks in this space. And there's an acknowledgement that has to take place, particularly with white people. I think we want to move quickly to tactics which will maybe benefit the greater good, but I may be, for want of a better term, it may be more masturbation for myself than actual intercourse. Am I actually doing something that gives me moments of pleasure without much productivity? Or am I actually, getting to a point of productivity and procreation? So
okay, got it. So
Williams said, he had a quote where he said, without lament, there is no ownership. And I think particularly for white people, if I have gone to the space of my own lament, my own ownership in racism over my own life, then I may be able to build on some tactical things and have conversations. Does that make sense?
Okay, got you. That's interesting. So let me tell you. First of all, I love the lament is such a heavy, useful word. So here's a choice I have taken in this project, but you're getting at it in an interesting way. So part of what I have structured this project to be is on some level an alternative to what I think can be a kind of navel-gazing, I hadn't used the term masturbatory, focus of a lot of work with white folks. Because my worry is that a lot of this sort of race work that white folk do, like it's all about me understanding myself better and me coming to a greater understanding of my whiteness, and basically it's the effort is all about me understanding myself more, but not enough on like you talking to your cousin. Remember, half of white folks don't even think racism is real. So part of the choice I've made is to say, if you think that racism is a problem, then you're on our team. And your job is to figure out better ways of talking to other people about that. And that starts, and one of the core place to start is like connecting with, if you think racism real in the world, let's talk about how racism is real within you. And then you need to start surfacing that and publicizing that. Now, that does tend to produce a certain, like it's introspective, but part of I've structured this effort is to not just foster introspection for sake of introspection, because I think that there's too much work that does that, because there's too much work that like is all internally focused, and you all you're doing is talking to people who have the same point of view as you, and you're not expanding the movement. So now I'm not against reflection, and I'm not against introspection. And I think that is important to do, but I guess I'll put it like this. My understanding, I've never been to India. My understanding is that there's a whole meditation school of meditation through jumping around. Like there's a whole, like we think of meditation as like you get calm and centered and you get in touch with yourself. And I think that there's a practice where you like meditate through action. Like it's within that action that you find your center. So I would just say that I believe in introspection, but I also think that if people have a practice of surfacing the racism within them, some reflection will go along with that as they develop the capacity to do that. So so I would just say, like, you know, I'm in favor of people. I'm in favor of people doing all sorts of inner work. But my concern is that inner work sometimes crowds out the outer work, and time is going on, and we're developing structures that are solidifying and concretizing our hierarchies. And one of the ways the reason that's happening is because too many white folks don't believe racism is real. So we need to immediately get on top of push for folks to start talking about that, and then as they do that, they will also do some more reflection and do lamenting that they need, but they need to be out there talking to people.
I mean,
Go ahead.
There's sort of bedfellows, right? You know, the introspection and the education, right, are these interesting bedfellows. I think one without the other doesn't necessarily work. If I'm a white person, I don't even believe racism exists. You've got a long stretch of getting me to a conversation about racism. So that's why I think there's sort of what's the parable, what's the Trojan horse? What's the way to make me consider something completely different, the metaphorical representation that gets me to have empathy for something. And then
okay, I mean, I hear you, and you know, I have the odd thing of this program is I've never been a white person doing what I'm teaching, so I'm inherently the blind guy leading the group, right? But I would just say I would offer that you're talking to somebody who doesn't think racism is real, and with the attitude of I'm going to reveal. I'm not trying to get this person to change their view in this conversation, right? I'm just trying to have an exploratory conversation about like what's going on both within me and in society. And I'm going to tell them about that time last week when I was in Walmart and the black guy walked by my car and I locked the door. I'm gonna tell him about that and raise the question of like I'm gonna feel bad, but not overly bad, because you're not trying to create, you don't put too much heaviness on it necessarily, right? But I'm going to talk about that and ask, what do they think that's about? And does anything ever happen like that to them? So I'm not saying this is a easy hill to climb, but I am saying that the vulnerability-based revelation of those kind of experiences and an invitation to help me make sense of that in light of what you experience and what society is experiencing. I think that if you're trying to get them to, in one conversation, to acknowledge like 400 years of systemic oppression, then that's a hard hill to climb. But if you're trying to have them like get in there with you about like little experiences that happen that seem like out of sync with your values, out of sync with your own values, and maybe out of sync with theirs, and maybe they have that, I think that's an easier hill to climb, and that's a step toward the larger understanding.
Well, Dr. David and Rick, thank you so much for that question and for the opening for that conversation. That's why I love the idea of engaged Buddhism, where you're taking all these philosophies and inner work, and then you're moving it into advocacy and activism, which is something that I navigate constantly, in the integration of our practices into the real world for real change. So again, Dr. David, do you have any final things you want to share? We're going to wrap up because we know that you've been so generous with your time.
Sure. I would just say that one of the things that we have, the Doing My Part as Anti-Racism Ally course that you were in, we're doing one in January, but even before that, we have a Race Method 101 online course. If you go to the dialoguecompany.com, you can get to our courses. It's also on, we're melding our websites. It's also on whiteallytoolkit.com. But yes, Race Method 101. It's a self-paced courses on a learning platform. And, there's a series of, like, there's video, watch videos, there's homework, you turn into homework, and then you allowed to go on to the next one. But the homeworks have been like refined over a period of time. I've written several books and got a lot of feedback on it. So the Race Method 101 course is something I would commend to people that that is going to be helpful to put them on this path. And I would advise people to check back with us, because one of the things that my team is talking about is doing I know a whole bunch of people are facing tension over the holidays. And first of all, we had this big divisive election, and then Thanksgiving is coming. Right? So one of the things that we're thinking about is redoing our Holiday Survive and Thrive guide. So I would encourage people to check back with us, because people need strategies to get through that. And so there's that. I would say that my handle is at the Dialogue Guy, and I would encourage people to go to the Dialogue Company Facebook page and like it, because no matter what they say, all likes matter.
Well done.
Somebody got my joke.
And we're awkwardly laughing. And by the way, I'm going to send in an email all these links to make sure everyone has all those resources. They can continue to connect with you and with your work.
This was great, Shira. Awesome. Dr. David, thank you so much for your time and for the work that you're doing, and for even talking about your jumper in the Oakland, Berkeley parks that I'm sure I also frequented. Maybe we frequented them together. I am 50 years old, so my jumper came a little later. But yeah, thank you so much for the work you do. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the deep explanations and unpacking of, your methodology. And I know it was, I'm getting text messages and DMs. They slide in my DMs all the time, Dr. David, and they are DMing me about your work.
All right.
And talking about everything that you're saying, and everybody is really loving it. So I know we're going to make this available, Shira. We're going to let this, because maybe people weren't on here that should have been on here, but I think we had a really good crowd, a really engaged crowd. And every other week we do this. We've moved the time now to Thursday at 9 a.m.
or 8 a.m. Pacific.
8 a.m. Sorry. Oh gosh, I don't know what time it is. We're gonna try to do this. We have some other tips and tricks up our sleeve for broader engagement and broader distribution of this content. And so thank you for continuing to tune in to The Other America, live from LA and everywhere else in the world.
Yeah. Dr. David Kempt, thank you so much again. You're a rock star. We appreciate everything.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, everyone have a beautiful day. Thank you so much. And of course, more with The Authenticated. And Peace Inside Live has meditation, mindfulness, movement classes on Zoom daily as well. So check us out at peaceinside.live. Many blessings, everyone. Have a beautiful rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.